They found her wedding dress before they found her body, soaked in mud, torn at the seams, thrown into the palace fountain like garbage. Everyone assumed Lady Elaira Vantressa had drowned herself after the scandal, after her father was dragged away in chains, after the man she loved slipped a ring onto another woman's finger in front of the entire court. For 3 years, the nobility whispered her name like a cautionary tale, the foolish girl who trusted too easily and paid for it with everything she had. What they didn't know was that Elaira never went into that fountain at all. She watched from the shadows of the garden wall as her best friend, the girl she had shared secrets with since they were 6 years old, smiled sweetly at the crowd and accepted their condolences for a death she herself had arranged. Elaira didn't scream, she didn't cry. She simply memorized every face that turned away from her that night, every noble who chose silence over justice, and one name above all others, Isolde Marrow. 3 years later, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a stranger's title returns to the capital. No one recognizes her eyes. But Isolde will, because ghosts, it turns out, remember everything. The Vantressa estate smelled of rain and fresh parchment on the morning everything began to unravel, though 17-year-old Elaira didn't know it yet. She sat cross-legged on the window seat of her chamber, a half-finished embroidery forgotten in her lap, watching the carriage wheels of her best friend crunch up the gravel drive. Isolde Marrow always arrived like that, unannounced, breathless, a storm of golden curls and mischief wrapped in silk. "You'll never believe what I heard," Isolde said, bursting through the door without knocking, the way she'd done since they were children playing hide-and-seek in these very halls. Elaira laughed, setting her needlework aside. "You say that every week. This time it's true. Lord Castellan is hosting a ball for his son's birthday and your father is invited. Elaira, the crown prince himself, might attend." Elaira's stomach fluttered, not because of the prince, but because of what invitations like these meant for her family. The Vantressas hadn't always belonged among the old noble houses. Her father Rutger Vantressa had clawed his way up from a merchant's ledger to a baron's seal through decades of honest trade and careful alliances, and every ball, every invitation, was a brick in the wall he was building so that Elaira would never have to fight the way he had. "Isolde," Elaira said, taking her friend's hands, "promise me something, anything. Whatever happens, whoever we become, we stay like this, just us. No court games between us." Isolde's smile didn't waver, not even slightly, and that was the first lie Elaira ever failed to notice. "Of course," Isolde said. "You're the only real thing in this entire rotten court, Elaira. I'd never let anything come between us." The words tasted like honey and would later taste like poison, but on that rain-softened afternoon, Elaira believed every syllable because why would she not? They had built 10 years of friendship on shared secrets, stolen sweets, and midnight promises whispered under blankets during thunderstorms. Trust for Elaira wasn't a decision. It was simply the air she breathed around Isolde Marrow. What Elaira didn't know, what she wouldn't learn for 3 more years, was that Isolde's family had fallen deeply into debt the previous winter. A debt so crushing that Isolde's own father had begun quietly selling off the family's remaining land to Baron Vantressa himself, hat in hand, humiliated in front of the very girl his daughter called a sister. Isolde had stood outside her father's study that night and listened to him weep after the meeting. Listened to him mutter that the Marrows were becoming nothing while the merchant's brat rose higher every season. Something had cracked inside Isolde that night, quiet and cold, and she had decided, with the calm clarity of someone who has finally stopped pretending, that she would rather destroy her closest friend than watch her family fall in her shadow forever. She simply hadn't decided how. Yet. The ball 3 weeks later would give her the perfect opportunity, though Elaira spent that evening thinking only of the deep blue gown Isolde had helped her choose, of the way her father beamed with pride watching her descend the staircase, of the young Duke Kaelin Ashgrave standing stiffly by the far wall watching her with an unreadable expression she mistook for indifference. She did not notice Isolde slipping away from her side twice that night. She did not notice the folded letter passed discreetly into the hand of Lord Castellan's steward, a letter written in a hand carefully disguised to resemble her father's, containing forged financial records suggesting Baron Vantressa had been bribing officials to secure his noble title illegally. She did not notice, because Isolde had spent 10 years teaching her not to notice, teaching her that a friend's smile meant safety, that a friend's hand on her shoulder meant she never had to look over it. By the time the first whispers began circulating through the ballroom, quiet as smoke, Elaira was already dancing her second dance, laughing at something Duke Ashgrave had said, utterly unaware that somewhere behind her, her entire world had already begun to catch fire. It would take 3 more months for the flames to fully consume everything she loved, but the spark, cruel and quiet, had already been struck by the one hand she trusted most. And as the musicians played on, and the candlelight flickered gold across the marble floor, no one in that glittering room could have guessed that the sweetest girl in the capital had just signed her best friend's death warrant with a single folded piece of paper. The accusations arrived like a slow poison rather than a single blow, which was exactly how Isolde had designed them. First came the murmurs at social gatherings, a raised eyebrow here, a conversation that stopped abruptly when Elaira entered a room there. Then came the official inquiry, launched quietly by the Ministry of Finance into Baron Vantressa's rapid rise through noble ranks. An inquiry that somehow already possessed detailed forged ledgers suggesting years of bribery and fraud. "This is absurd," Rutger Vantressa said, pacing his study while Elaira watched from the doorway, her heart hammering. "I built everything through honest trade. Someone wants to destroy us, Elaira, and I intend to find out who." Elaira wanted to believe her father's confidence, wanted to trust that truth would simply rise to the surface the way it always had in the stories she'd grown up loving. Stories where good people were vindicated and liars were exposed before the final page. But real life, she was about to learn, rarely followed a story's mercy. She sought comfort in the one place she always had, Isolde's company, never once suspecting that comfort was the very trap closing around her. "It's horrible," Isolde said, squeezing her hand tightly across the tea table, her eyes glistening with what looked like genuine tears. "Whoever's doing this to your family is a monster. I've been asking around, trying to find out who might benefit from your father's fall." Elaira didn't know that Isolde had spent the previous evening in a private meeting with Lord Castellan, subtly steering the investigation toward Rutger's business partners, planting just enough doubt to keep the inquiry alive while appearing, to everyone including Elaira, as her family's most devoted ally. It was a masterwork of quiet cruelty, made possible only because Isolde understood Elaira so completely, knew exactly which reassurances would calm her, exactly which fears to leave untouched so they would fester privately instead of driving her to dig deeper. Meanwhile, Duke Kaelin Ashgrave had begun making quiet inquiries of his own, unprompted, unannounced, using his family's considerable influence to review the financial documents being circulated against Baron Vantressa. He said nothing to Elaira about it. Their acquaintance was still new, formal, built on a handful of dances, and a shared appreciation for old poetry rather than any declared affection. But something about the swiftness of the accusations struck him as unnatural, too clean, too convenient. He kept his suspicions to himself, unwilling to interfere in a matter that wasn't yet his to interfere in, a decision he would later regret with a bitterness that never fully faded. The inquiry dragged through autumn into winter, each week bringing fresh evidence mysteriously surfacing at precisely the moment public sympathy for the Vantressas threatened to grow too strong. Rutger's business partners, frightened for their own reputations, began quietly severing ties. Invitations that once arrived weekly slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Elaira watched her father age a decade in a single season, watched the confident man who had built an empire from nothing become a hollow-eyed stranger who barely slept, and through it all Isolde remained her constant companion. Her shoulder to cry on, her voice of reassurance in the darkest hours. The architect of every tear Elaira shed, standing close enough to witness her own handiwork and call it comfort. It was during one such evening, as Elaira wept quietly in Isolde's arms after a particularly cruel round of accusations, that Isolde made her first genuine miscalculation. "You still have me," Isolde whispered, stroking Elaira's hair. "No matter what they take from you, they can't take this." Elaira, in her grief, clung to those words as the last solid ground beneath her feet. But something in Isolde's tone, a note of satisfaction too subtle for Elaira to consciously register, but not subtle enough to vanish entirely, lodged itself somewhere in the back of Elaira's mind. A splinter she wouldn't understand until much later, when the wound had already grown too deep to ignore. That winter, the ministry announced its findings. Baron Rutger Vantressa was formally charged with fraud, bribery, and impersonation of nobility under false pretenses, charges carrying a sentence of permanent estate seizure and imprisonment. The night the guards came for her father, dragging him from his own dining room in front of the household staff, Elaira ran through the halls screaming his name, reaching for hands that pulled her back, for a rescue that never came. And in the chaos of that terrible night, as chains closed around her father's wrists, Elaira caught a single glimpse of a figure watching from the garden gate, perfectly composed, perfectly still, wearing an expression Elaira was too devastated to properly read. It was only years later, replaying that night in her mind 1,000 times over, that she would finally understand what she'd seen in Isolde's face that evening wasn't grief at all. It was quiet, satisfied relief. Grief has a way of making people cling harder to whatever kindness remains. And in the 6 months following her father's imprisonment, Elaira clung to two things: her fading engagement to a minor lord named Cassian Brightwell, arranged years earlier by her father as insurance against exactly this kind of disaster, and Isolde, who remained by her side through every humiliation, every closed door, every whispered insult in the marketplace. What Elaira didn't know was that Cassian Brightwell had been quietly courted by Isolde for the better part of a year, long before the scandal ever broke, not out of romantic interest, but out of pure, calculated strategy. Cassian's family held a modest but respectable estate bordering the Marrowlands, exactly the kind of merger that could restore Isolde's family's crumbling fortune without the messy business of scandal or debt forgiveness. Isolde had simply been waiting for the right moment to collect what she'd already spent a year quietly arranging. That moment arrived 3 days before Elaira's own wedding was to take place, a small, hastily planned ceremony meant to salvage what little remained of the Vantressa name by binding it to the still respectable Brightwell house. Elaira stood in her fitting room, admiring the pale blue gown Isolde had insisted on choosing for her, unaware that Isolde had spent the previous evening in Cassian's private study tearfully confessing a fabricated story about Elaira's father secretly attempting to swindle the Brightwell family's own finances through the marriage contract. A final, desperate lie built from nothing but Isolde's talent for knowing exactly what fear would land hardest. "He loves you," Isolde said that morning, helping pin the veil into Elaira's hair, her voice soft with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Everything is going to be all right now, Elaira, you'll see." Elaira believed her the way she'd believed her for 10 unbroken years, right up until the moment she walked into the chapel garden 3 days later and found it empty except for a single folded letter waiting on the altar, and Cassian Brightwell standing at the far end of the aisle beside a beaming Isolde Marrow, a betrothal ring glittering on her outstretched hand. "I'm sorry, Elaira," Cassian said, unable to meet her eyes. "I can't marry into a family under criminal investigation, surely you understand." Elaira didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stared at Isolde's hand, at the ring, at the small, satisfied curve of her oldest friend's lips before Isolde arranged her expression into something resembling sympathy. "I tried to stop it," Isolde said, stepping forward, reaching for Elaira's hands the way she'd done 1,000 times before. "I told him he was wrong to abandon you, but Elaira, someone has to think about the future. I couldn't just watch our families fall together." The words landed like individual knives, each one precisely aimed, and it was in that single frozen moment, standing alone in her wedding gown in an empty garden watching her best friend claim the life that was supposed to be hers, that something inside Elaira finally permanently broke, not into hysteria, not into tears, into something colder and quieter, a silence that would eventually become the foundation of everything she was about to build. She walked home alone that afternoon, still in her wedding dress, past the whispers and the pointing fingers, and locked herself in her chambers for 3 days, without eating, without speaking, replaying 10 years of friendship through this new terrible lens, searching for every moment she'd missed, every warning sign she'd been too trusting to see. On the 4th day, a letter arrived from the palace, informing her that her father had died in his cell, officially of illness, though no physician's report was ever produced. Elaira read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it inside the small wooden box where she kept her father's old pocket watch, the only possession of his the ministry hadn't seized. Then she opened her window, looked out at the palace fountain glittering in the distance, and began, for the first time in her life, to plan something entirely her own, a plan built not on trust, but on the cold, clear understanding of exactly how thoroughly she had been betrayed. What the capital would soon whisper about was a young noblewoman's tragic drowning. What actually happened that night was far stranger and far more deliberate than anyone, including Isolde Marrow, who watched the fountain from her carriage window with quiet satisfaction, could have possibly imagined. The truth was simpler and colder than any grand escape story the court would later invent to explain her disappearance. Elaira hadn't jumped, hadn't fled in a moment of dramatic despair. She had walked deliberately into the palace gardens after midnight, torn her own gown against the fountain's stone edge, and left it floating on the surface where a guard would be certain to find it by morning. She had planned it for 3 days in the cold silence after her father's death, understanding with brutal clarity that Elaira Vantressa, trusting, hopeful, endlessly forgiving Elaira Vantressa, needed to die if she was ever going to survive what came next. A small trunk, packed weeks earlier and hidden beneath a loose floorboard, contained everything she needed: a modest sum of coins scraped together from selling her mother's jewelry piece by piece over the preceding months, a plain traveling cloak, and her father's pocket watch. She left the capital before dawn. riding in the back of a merchant's cart under a borrowed name, and didn't look back at the city walls even once, though she felt them watching her the entire way. The way a burned house watches the person who finally walks away from its ashes. The following 3 years were not the stuff of fairy tales. Elaira, who began calling herself Selene, a name with no history, no family, no expectations attached to it, worked first as a scribe's assistant in a provincial trading town. Then as a translator for a merchant guild that valued her sharp mind and her willingness to work twice as hard as anyone questioning a friendless young woman's presence. She learned to read financial ledgers the way other women read romance novels, learned the quiet mechanics of trade routes, tariffs, and noble debt structures that had once seemed impossibly boring to the girl who'd grown up more interested in poetry than politics. She learned, most importantly, how easily reputations could be built, bought, or destroyed with nothing more than careful information placed in the right hands at the right moment. The exact weapon that had been used against her, now becoming the foundation of everything she was rebuilding. It was during her second year in hiding that fortune, or perhaps fate, intervened in the unlikely form of Duke Kaelin Ashgrave, traveling incognito through the same provincial town while investigating irregularities in his family's trade contracts. He didn't recognize her at first. 3 years, and a false name had changed more than her appearance. They changed the very way she carried herself, guarded and precise where she'd once been open and warm. But something about the sharp, unflinching way she corrected an error in his steward's contract caught his attention enough to offer her a position reviewing his household's finances. Elaira accepted under her false name, telling herself it was purely practical, purely strategic. The Ashgrave household's records touched nearly every noble family in the capital, including, eventually, the Marrows. She did not tell herself the other reason. The quieter one she barely admitted even in the privacy of her own thoughts. That some small stubborn part of her still remembered a young man standing stiffly at a ballroom wall 3 years earlier watching her, with an expression she'd once mistaken for indifference. It took Kaelin the better part of a year to notice the truth, though when he finally did, it happened all at once. A single unguarded moment when Elaira, exhausted after weeks of overwork, absent-mindedly hummed a lullaby he recognized from a single dance they'd shared at that long-ago ball, a small private melody she'd once told him her mother used to sing. He said nothing that evening. But the following morning he requested a private meeting, closed the study door, and set her father's confiscated pocket watch, the one item from the Vantressa estate seizure that Kaelin had quietly purchased at auction years earlier, unable to explain to himself why he'd bothered, on the desk between them. "I don't know what name you're using," he said quietly, "but I know whose watch this is." Elaira's hand trembled, reaching for it, 3 years of careful composure threatening to crack entirely in a single moment. And for the first time since that terrible night by the fountain, she allowed herself to say her real name out loud to another living person. What followed wasn't the reunion of old acquaintances catching up on lost time. It was the beginning of an alliance, quiet, deliberate, and utterly ruthless, between two people who had both, in their own ways, learned exactly how dangerous unchecked power could become when it went unchallenged for too long. And somewhere in the capital, Isolde Marrow, now Lady Brightwell, mother to a healthy young son and mistress of a rapidly expanding estate, had no idea that the ghost she'd created was about to walk back through the front gates of the very court that had buried her. The capital had a new fascination that sprang, a subject of gossip that spread through every drawing room and dinner party within a matter of weeks. A mysterious widow recently arrived from the eastern provinces, whose late husband had apparently left her an enormous fortune, and whose face, veiled at every public appearance, no one had yet managed to glimpse. She called herself Lady Selene Ashfell, and the sheer scale of her wealth, carefully constructed over 3 years through Duke Ashgrave's discreet financial guidance and Elaira's own ruthless understanding of trade markets, made her instantly, irresistibly interesting to a nobility that worshipped little as devoutly as it worshipped money. Her first public appearance was calculated down to the smallest detail. She arrived at the autumn gala on Duke Ashgrave's arm, a scandal in itself, given his famous reluctance to attend social functions at all. Wearing a gown the deep, unforgiving black of mourning, cut in a style so striking it made every other woman in the room look overdressed by comparison. The veil lifted only once, briefly, deliberately, at the exact moment she knew Isolde Marrow, now 4 months pregnant with her second child, radiant and secure in her position as Lady Brightwell, happened to be looking in her direction. Isolde's wine glass didn't shatter. Her expression didn't change in any way another guest might have noticed. But Elaira, watching from behind her veil with the patient attentiveness of someone who had spent 3 years learning to read the smallest human tells, saw it, the single frozen heartbeat of pure, unfiltered recognition before Isolde's composure slammed back into place like a portcullis dropping. She knows, Elaira thought, feeling something settle inside her chest that was neither triumph nor fear, but simply cold, clean certainty. Good, let her wonder. Over the following weeks, Lady Selene Ashfell became the court's most sought-after new addition, hosting salons that quickly became essential attendants for anyone hoping to remain relevant in noble circles. Her sharp wit and startling financial acumen making her as valuable a connection as she was fascinating a mystery. She used those salons precisely as Kaelin had helped her plan, not for gossip, though gossip flowed freely through her rooms, but for information gathering, carefully steering conversations toward Cashin Brightwell's business dealings. Toward the increasingly precarious state of the Marrow family finances, that Isolde's marriage had never actually fixed so much as temporarily disguised. What Elaira discovered within her first month of careful listening confirmed something she'd long suspected, but never had proof of. Isolde hadn't simply seized an opportunity when she destroyed the Vantressa family. She had engineered the entire catastrophe from the very beginning. Forging the original financial documents herself using a skilled but discreet document forger, still operating quietly in the capital's less reputable districts, a man Elaira tracked down within 3 weeks through nothing more than patient bribery, and the kind of information network money alone could buy. The forger, an aging man named Corwin Hale who'd long since retired from his criminal trade and now lived in fear of exactly this kind of visit, confirmed everything with trembling hands the moment Elaira's men made clear exactly how much trouble he could avoid by cooperating. She paid well, Hale admitted, unable to meet Elaira's veiled gaze across his cramped workshop. Young thing, golden hair, cold eyes even then, said her friend's father had wronged her family somehow. I never asked questions. Wasn't my business what happened after I handed over the papers. Elaira sat perfectly still through this confession, 3 years of carefully constructed composure the only thing standing between her and the scream building in her chest, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out steadier than she'd believed possible. I need copies of everything, she said. The original commission letter, any correspondence, and I need you to remember every detail of her face because you're going to describe it to a magistrate very soon. Corwin Hale went pale enough that Elaira almost pitied him. Almost. But pity, she reminded herself firmly, walking back out into the gray afternoon light, was a luxury belonging to the girl who died in that fountain 3 years ago. Selene Ashfell had no room left for it, not when she finally at long last held in her hands the single piece of proof capable of destroying Isolde Marrow's entire carefully constructed life. Proof she had no intention of using quickly or mercifully or in any way Isolde might see coming until it was already far, far too late. Isolde Marrow had not survived 3 years as Lady Brightwell by being careless, and the unsettling arrival of Lady Selene Ashfell triggered every instinct she'd honed since childhood, the same instincts that had once told a frightened, humiliated girl exactly how to destroy her closest friend without anyone ever suspecting her involvement. She began quietly investigating the mysterious widow herself, hiring her own discreet inquiries into Lady Ashfell's background, only to find every trail leading maddeningly nowhere. A late husband, whose estate records seemed to exist only on paper, an Eastern Province origin that no genealogist could quite trace back further than 3 years. The lack of answers frightened Isolde more than any concrete threat could have, because Isolde understood better than almost anyone in the capital exactly how easily a false history could be constructed for someone determined enough to disappear and re-emerge as something entirely new. She found herself lying awake beside Cashin, staring at the ceiling, running through every person from her past who might possibly harbor enough hatred and enough resources to orchestrate something this elaborate, and found with a chill she couldn't quite explain even to herself that only one name kept surfacing in her memory no matter how firmly she tried to push it away. It's not possible, she told herself night after night. She's dead, I made certain of it, but certainty Isolde was slowly discovering was a far more fragile thing than she'd once believed, especially when Lady Ashfell began appearing at increasingly specific events. A horse auction, Cashin frequented a charity function organized by Isolde's own mother, a private card game hosted by one of Isolde's closest confidants. Each encounter brief, polite, utterly unremarkable on the surface, and each one leaving Isolde more convinced that the pattern was deliberate rather than coincidental. The confrontation, when it finally came, happened almost by accident at a garden party neither woman had particularly wanted to attend. Isolde, heavily pregnant and increasingly desperate for answers, cornered Lady Ashfell near a secluded hedge maze, away from the crowd's watchful eyes. I don't know who you are, Isolde said quietly, her hand resting protectively over her rounded belly, but I know you've been following me. I want to know why. Elaira allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to make Isolde's composure fracture visibly at the edges before finally lifting her veil. Not entirely, just enough to let a single shaft of afternoon light fall across her face, just enough for recognition to land like a physical blow. Isolde's breath caught audibly, her hand flew to her throat. For several long seconds she simply stared, mouth working soundlessly, the color draining entirely from her face. You're supposed to be dead, Isolde finally whispered, barely audible. I watched them find your dress. You watched them find a dress, Elaira corrected softly, her voice carrying none of the rage she'd expected to feel in this moment, only a terrible, exhausted calm. You never actually watched me die, Isolde. There's a difference. A difference I imagine you've had 3 years to worry about, on the nights your conscience decided to bother visiting. I did what I had to do, Isolde said, recovering some of her composure, though her hands remained visibly unsteady. You don't understand what it was like, watching your family climb over ours, watching my father beg your father for mercy while your family grew richer and richer. You destroyed my father over jealousy, Elaira said, cutting through the excuse with quiet precision. You forged documents that got an innocent man killed in a prison cell, Isolde. He never even received a trial worthy of the name. He died believing his own daughter's best friend had tried to help him. Isolde flinched at that. A small, involuntary movement that told Elaira everything she needed to know about how deeply that particular truth still sat in whatever remained of Isolde's conscience. What do you want? Isolde asked finally, her voice small in a way Elaira hadn't heard since they were children frightened of thunderstorms together, decades and a lifetime of betrayal ago. Elaira lowered her veil back into place, the moment of vulnerability closing like a door. I want you to understand something very clearly, she said. I'm not here for a confrontation in a garden maze, Isolde. I'm here for everything you took from me, and I intend to take my time collecting it. She walked away without another word, leaving Isolde alone among the hedges with one trembling hand still pressed against her belly, and a fear finally fully justified settling into her chest like winter frost. Because whatever composed, careful woman had just walked away from her bore no resemblance whatsoever to the trusting girl she'd once so easily destroyed. And Isolde understood with sudden terrible clarity that she had absolutely no idea what that woman was now capable of. Fear, Elaira had learned during her years of quiet study, was a far more effective weapon than confrontation, and in the weeks following the garden maze encounter, she deployed it with surgical precision rather than dramatic flourish. She didn't threaten Isolde again, didn't approach her, didn't even acknowledge her presence at the several social functions where their paths inevitably crossed. Instead, she let Isolde's own imagination do the damage, watching from a careful distance as her former friend grew visibly thinner, more distracted. Snapping at servants and dismissing her own social calendar with increasing frequency as pregnancy exhaustion mixed dangerously with paranoid uncertainty about exactly what Selene Ashfell knew and precisely when she intended to use it. Meanwhile, working alongside Duke Ashgrave and a small, carefully vetted circle of allies, a magistrate sympathetic to overturned convictions, a scholar specializing in forensic document analysis, and Corwin Hale, whose continued cooperation was secured through a combination of financial incentive and the very real threat of his own criminal exposure. Elaira began methodically constructing the legal case that would eventually unmake everything Isolde had built. The process required a patience that tested even Elaira's considerable reserves. 3 additional months of quietly gathering corroborating evidence, tracking down former ministry officials who'd handled her father's original case, and were willing for the right price and sufficient guarantees of protection to admit under oath that the evidence against him had struck them as unusually clean, unusually convenient. Arriving in a manner that suggested advanced preparation rather than genuine investigative discovery. We suspected something was wrong, one retired official admitted during a private meeting arranged through intermediaries who never revealed Elaira's true identity even to him. But questioning it would have meant questioning powerful people's motives, and men in my position learned long ago which questions were permitted to ask. Elaira absorbed this confirmation of institutional cowardice with the same cold precision she'd applied to everything else in her rebuilding, understanding that her revenge, if it was to mean anything lasting, couldn't simply punish Isolde alone. It needed to expose the entire rotten system that had allowed a forged document and a well-placed lie to destroy an innocent man's life without a single person along the way finding the courage to ask an obvious question. It was during this period that her relationship with Kalen deepened into something neither of them had explicitly acknowledged, but both privately understood forged through countless late nights, reviewing documents together through his quiet, steady presence during moments when the weight of what she was uncovering threatened to crack her carefully maintained composure entirely. "You don't have to do all of this alone," he told her one evening, finding her still awake at his study desk long past midnight, surrounded by depositions and financial records, exhaustion evident in the tight set of her shoulders. "I know," Elaira said quietly, not looking up from the document in her hands, "but some debts, Kalen, you have to collect yourself, otherwise the person who owes them never truly understands what they took." Kalen didn't argue the point. Though he stayed with her that evening long past, when propriety would have suggested he leave reading through documents alongside her in comfortable unspoken solidarity, and it was in that quiet, unremarkable moment, not in any grand romantic gesture but in simple, steady companionship through her darkest work, that Elaira finally allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been carefully avoiding for months, that whatever she felt for this quiet, watchful man had grown into something far deeper than simple gratitude for his early kindness. The case, when it finally reached completion, was devastating in its thoroughness. Forged document analysis, confirming Corwin Hale's original commission, sworn testimony from the retired ministry official, and finally, most damningly, an original draft of the forged financial ledger discovered still hidden in a locked drawer of Isolde's childhood bedroom at her parents' estate. Retrieved through a carefully arranged, charitable inspection of the property that Elaira's legal allies had orchestrated under an entirely unrelated pretense, Isolde, unaware that the final irrefutable piece of evidence against her had just been quietly removed from her own family home, continued through her days consumed by dread over a threat she still couldn't fully name, utterly unprepared for the reality that Lady Selene Ashfell wasn't merely planning to expose her. She was preparing to do it in the most public, most catastrophically humiliating manner imaginable. In front of the very court that had once so eagerly believed every lie Isolde had ever told them. The Winter Court Assembly was the single most attended event of the noble calendar, a formal gathering where the Crown Regent presided over matters of law inheritance disputes and formal petitions requiring royal judgment. Precisely the kind of high-visibility setting Elaira had spent months carefully arranging access to, using Duke Ashgrave's considerable political standing to secure a formal petition slot under the pretense of a minor property dispute requiring the regent's attention. Isolde Marrow, now visibly close to her delivery date and increasingly fragile beneath the strain of months of unexplained dread, attended only because her absence from such a significant event would have raised exactly the kind of questions her carefully maintained reputation could no longer survive. She sat beside Cashin in the Assembly's noble gallery, one hand resting on her belly, trying and failing to ignore the veiled woman seated with quiet, unnerving composure in the petitioners' section below. When Lady Selene Ashfell's petition was finally called, the Assembly Hall's murmur of idle conversation died down out of simple curiosity rather than any anticipation of drama. Most present expected a routine property matter, the kind of tedious legal formality that filled the majority of the Assembly's actual business. Elaira rose, veil still lowered, and addressed the Crown Regent with a composure that had taken 3 years and immeasurable grief to construct. "Your Grace," she began, "I come before this Assembly not regarding property, but regarding a grave miscarriage of justice that occurred within these very halls nearly 4 years ago. The wrongful conviction and death in custody of Baron Elaira Vantressa, convicted on evidence I can now prove beyond any reasonable doubt was deliberately fabricated." The murmur that swept through the gallery this time carried an entirely different quality, sharp with sudden, hungry attention, and Elaira felt Isolde's gaze land on her with the force of a physical blow even through the veil separating them. "This is a serious accusation," the Crown Regent said, leaning forward with the careful interest of a man who understood exactly how much political capital a genuine scandal could generate. "Do you have proof to support such a claim?" "I do," Elaira said, and one by one. With the methodical precision of someone who had planned every single moment of this confrontation down to its smallest detail, she presented her case. Corwin Hale's sworn testimony delivered in person before the assembled court, the forensic analysis confirming the forged document's true origin. The retired ministry official's admission that the original evidence had seemed suspiciously prepared in advance, and finally, devastatingly, the original draft ledger recovered from Isolde Marrow's own childhood bedroom. Its handwriting formally confirmed by 3 independent scholars to match samples of Isolde's own correspondence collected from over a dozen willing former acquaintances. The assembly hall fell into absolute silence, as each piece of evidence was presented, a silence that grew heavier and more suffocating with every passing minute. Until finally, inevitably, every eye in the room turned toward Isolde Marot, seated frozen in the noble gallery, with an expression of pure unmasked horror, finally breaking through years of carefully maintained composure. "This is preposterous," Cashin said, rising beside his wife, his voice carrying the particular desperation of a man watching his entire carefully constructed life crumble in real time. "My wife would never," "Your wife," Elaira said, finally lifting her veil fully for the first time in front of the entire assembled court, "commissioned the forged documents herself from a forger who has just testified to that fact under oath in order to destroy my family and inherit both my fiancé and my family's remaining social standing. My name is Elaira Vantressa. I did not drown myself in that fountain 4 years ago. I survived Lord Brightwell specifically so that I could stand in this hall today and watch your wife answer for what she did to my father." The revelation of her true identity detonated through the assembly hall like an explosion, gasps and cries of astonishment erupting from every corner of the gallery. And through it all, Isolde sat perfectly terribly still, staring at the face of the friend she'd believed dead for 4 years. Watching every carefully constructed lie of her adult life collapse in real time before the entire capital's most powerful witnesses. "Elaira," Isolde finally managed, her voice barely a whisper in the chaos surrounding them. "Please." "Please what?" Elaira asked, and for the first time in 4 years, something in her voice cracked just slightly, just enough to reveal the grieving girl still buried somewhere beneath everything Selene Ashfell had built. "Please forgive you, please understand. I watched my father die believing you tried to save him, Isolde. I stood in an empty chapel garden in my wedding dress watching you claim my fiancé with a smile on your face. There is no please large enough to undo 4 years of exactly what you built, brick by careful brick, believing I would never live long enough to make you answer for it." The Crown Regent, recovering his own composure amid the continuing chaos, called for immediate order, announcing that given the severity and public nature of the evidence presented, formal charges would be filed against Lady Isolde Brightwell pending full investigation. A declaration that sent Isolde crumpling forward in her seat, one hand still pressed protectively over her unborn child. Sobbing openly in front of the entire assembled court that had once so completely believed every carefully constructed lie she'd ever told them, while Elaira stood motionless in the center of the hall, finally, after 4 impossibly long years. Watching justice arrive precisely as slowly and precisely as devastatingly as she had always sworn it would. Formal charges did not translate into immediate resolution, and the weeks following Isolde's public exposure unfolded with a complicated messiness that no dramatic courtroom revelation could fully account for. Isolde, protected from immediate imprisonment by her advanced pregnancy, and the regent's own uncertainty about how harshly to punish a woman about to give birth, remained confined to the Brightwell estate under formal house arrest, while the full investigation proceeded. Her golden reputation reduced overnight to something closer to a cautionary tale whispered at every dinner party she'd once dominated. Cashin, humiliated and furious, filed for immediate annulment of their marriage, unwilling to have his family's name further associated with the scandal. Despite the 2 children Isolde had already borne him, a decision that left Isolde facing her impending 3rd delivery in devastating isolation, stripped of nearly everything she'd once destroyed a friendship to acquire. Elaira, watching this slow unraveling from a careful distance, found herself surprised by the complicated, unwelcome grief that occasionally surfaced amid what should have been pure satisfaction. Not grief for Isolde's punishment, which she considered entirely unquestionably deserved, but grief for the decade of genuine friendship that had existed before the betrayal, memories that refused to simply disappear no matter how thoroughly the woman who'd created them had proven herself capable of monstrous cruelty. "It doesn't feel the way I thought it would," she admitted to Kaelin one evening, seated together in his study, the formal charges finally, officially filed after weeks of legal proceedings. "I thought exposing her would feel like closing a door. Instead, it feels like standing in the wreckage of a house I used to live in, trying to remember which parts were ever real. Maybe none of it needs to feel resolved the way stories make it seem like it should," Kaelin said quietly, taking her hand across the desk in a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them over the preceding months. "Grief and justice aren't the same thing, Elaira. You can have justice for your father and still grieve the friend you thought Isolde was before she showed you who she actually became." His words settled something in her that she hadn't realized needed settling. A permission she hadn't known she was waiting for to simply feel whatever she felt without demanding it, resolve into something cleaner, something more satisfying. than the messy, complicated truth of watching someone she'd loved for a decade finally face consequences for destroying everything she'd once claimed to cherish. The formal trial, when it finally proceeded 3 months later following Isolde's delivery of a healthy daughter, was almost anticlimactic in its brevity compared to the dramatic assembly confrontation that had launched the investigation. The evidence was simply too thorough, too meticulously documented for any credible defense to survive serious scrutiny. Isolde was formally convicted of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, resulting in wrongful death, sentenced to permanent exile from the capital and forfeiture of the Marot family's remaining assets. A sentence that stopped short of imprisonment, only because of the young children who would otherwise have been left entirely without a parent, a mercy Elaira herself had quietly petitioned the regent to consider. A decision that surprised everyone who expected her revenge to demand nothing less than Isolde's complete destruction. Why? Kaelin asked her afterward, genuinely curious rather than critical, as they walked together through the palace gardens where everything had first begun to unravel 4 years earlier. You could have asked for far worse and no one would have questioned it. Elaira considered the question for a long moment, watching late afternoon light scatter gold across the same fountain where her old life had officially ended. Because I spent 4 years becoming someone capable of surviving what she did to me, she finally said. But I don't want to become someone who destroys children to punish their mother. That's her kind of cruelty, Kaelin, not mine. It was perhaps the truest measure of exactly how completely Elaira had transformed since that terrible autumn evening in the chapel garden. Not into someone hardened beyond all feeling, as the capital's frightened gossip had begun to suggest in the weeks following her dramatic return, but into someone who had learned to wield justice with precision rather than indiscriminate rage, someone who understood with hard-won clarity the crucial difference between demanding accountability and becoming the very cruelty she'd spent 4 years surviving. As Isolde's carriage departed the capital for the last time the following week, watched by a small crowd of curious onlookers rather than the sympathetic well-wishers who might once have gathered, Elaira stood at a distance unseen and allowed herself finally the smallest measure of peace. Not celebration, not triumph, but simply the quiet, hard-earned understanding that the girl who had once trusted so completely and paid so terribly for it had finally, after 4 impossibly long years, learned exactly how to survive in a world that had taught her trust, could be the sharpest weapon of all. Without losing entirely the capacity for mercy that made her survival worth something more than simple vengeance. Spring returned to the capital the following year with a gentleness the city hadn't seen in longer than anyone could clearly remember. And Elaira Vantressa no longer hiding behind veils or borrowed names. Her father's original title and remaining estate formally restored to her by royal decree in recognition of the grave injustice done to her family, stood once more on the steps of the very chapel where her wedding to Cassian Brightwell had never taken place. Though for entirely different reasons than 4 years earlier. This time she wore not the pale, hopeful blue she'd chosen as an innocent 17-year-old, but a deep, rich burgundy that Kaelin had once told her in a rare, unguarded moment. Reminded him of the exact color of the wine they'd shared the evening she finally told him her real name. Their wedding was smaller than tradition typically demanded for a duke's marriage. Attended by the handful of people who had actually earned their place in the rebuilt life Elaira had constructed with such painstaking care. Corwin Hale pardoned for his cooperation, and now living quietly under Elaira's continued protection. The retired ministry official, who'd finally found the courage to speak truth after decades of comfortable silence, and Kaelin's small circle of genuinely loyal allies, who had supported their quiet investigation from its earliest, most uncertain days. Notably absent was the vast majority of noble society that had once so eagerly attended Elaira's first catastrophically interrupted wedding, a fact that bothered her not even slightly as she looked out at the small, genuine gathering assembled to witness a joy that had been 4 devastating years in the making. "You once told me," Kaelin said quietly as they stood together before the assembled guests. The officiant's formal words fading into background noise beneath the weight of everything they'd survived to reach this moment, "that you wanted us to stay exactly as we were no matter what the court tried to make of us. I think about that promise sometimes. I think you finally got to keep it, just not with the friend you originally made it to." Elaira felt tears gather, unbidden and entirely welcome, for the first time in longer than she could remember allowing herself such simple, uncomplicated feeling. "I made a lot of promises to the wrong person, back when I thought trust was something you gave freely and never had to question," she said. "It took me a long time to learn that trust isn't really about believing everyone deserves it. It's about learning who's actually earned it and holding on to exactly those people fiercely enough that losing the ones who didn't stops mattering quite so much. Word of the wedding reached Isolde eventually. In the small eastern province, where she now lived in quiet exile with her 3 children working as a translator's assistant in a life far humbler than anything the golden girl of the capital could once have imagined for herself. And though the letters between them remained infrequent and carefully formal, Elaira had in the years following the trial found herself unable to fully sever every remaining thread connecting them, sending occasional support for the children who bore no responsibility for their mother's choices. A small mercy that cost Elaira nothing, and meant based on Isolde's rare careful responses more than either woman fully knew how to properly express. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Elaira understood clearly even years later that some betrayals reshape a person too fundamentally to ever fully forgive, no matter how much time passes or how thoroughly justice gets served. But it was something adjacent to peace. A hard-won understanding that carrying hatred forever would only ever cost her more than it cost the person she directed it toward. A lesson she'd learned slowly, painfully, across 4 years of transformation from a trusting girl into a woman, the entire capital now quietly respectfully called the most formidable noble in the realm, not for her cruelty, though her enemies certainly feared it, but for her unwavering, hard-earned refusal to ever again mistake someone's smile for proof of their loyalty. As the ceremony concluded, and Elaira Vantressa became formally and finally Duchess Ashgrave, she looked out at the small, genuine gathering of people who had actually earned her trust across 4 devastating years, and felt for the first time since she was 17 years old, and utterly certain the world would always be kind to her, something that felt remarkably, wonderfully like being entirely, unshakably home. The girl who had once believed a friend's promise meant forever was gone, buried somewhere in a fountain's dark water 4 years earlier. But the woman who had risen in her place understood something that girl never could have, that surviving betrayal doesn't require becoming someone who trusts no one ever again. It simply requires becoming someone strong enough to choose, very carefully, exactly who deserves the chance to prove themselves worthy of it.